for coming. My name is Bastiaan Manintveld, and today I'm going to speak a little bit about the complexities of multi-platform video on-demand workflow to give you a sense of all the stuff that's going on behind the curtains when people deliver a video on-demand service to many different screens. The company that I work for is called Arkina. It's an international media services company. We're in 9 different countries. We have 500 people, and we do a lot of different things in the media services value chain. The way that I ended up there is because I started a company in 2008 called Bibanjo, which was like a software company that helps people to manage their video on-demand services more efficiently. And in 2011, I sold it to the TDF Group, which then later rebranded its media services unit as Arkina. So that's how I ended up there with the company. If you want to talk to me or you want to send me questions, suggestions, funny jokes, this is my email address. So when you are managing a video on-demand service, there's really 2 things, or any television service really, there's really 2 things that you care about. Like, you want to be efficient, so you want to spend the minimum amount of time, money and resources possible to meet your desired objective, which is getting the content on the right screen, in the right format, in the right quality, at the right time. And you want to be effective. You want to make sure that actually what you set out to do, that you do it well. So those are the 2 things that we care about. So to show you today a little bit how complex this can get if you're managing like a large volume of content from many different content suppliers to many different platforms, I'm going to do something that's like a fancy English word. It's called like fear-mongering, which means I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, but just a little bit, to get my point across that it's actually quite hard to do this well if you want to do it in a big way. So what we are looking at here is an example of a user interface element. Now this one happens to come from the iTunes store, and you're probably all quite familiar with it, and the things that you find here inside this part of the user interface are actually pretty common across all sorts of different services. So what we have here is we have some metadata, we have a synopsis, we have the name of the title, we see that it's an action and adventure movie, that the content provider is Lionsgate. We have 2 different types of box art, especially formatted for this particular user interface. Then we have some technical metadata. So here we see how long the movie lasts, what like the file size is, whether there's any Dolby audio included, and so on and so forth. And then what we see is we actually have different versions of this particular title. So we have like an HD version, we have an SD version, we have a version to stream, to rent, we have a version to download, and we also have a trailer. So for this one particular movie, you see that there's quite a lot of elements. So imagine right now that it's your job to make this happen. So to bring all of these elements together to create this particular page in the user interface and make sure that it works. So how are you going to go about it? Well, I don't think it's super hard. Basically what you do is you start by securing the rights, because it's not your movie, you didn't make it, so you got to talk to Lionsgate, make sure they give you the rights, make sure you agree on commercial conditions, that you know what price you can sell it at, when you can sell it, which business model can you offer it to rent or to buy or both. So you make some kind of deal with the content owner so that you have the rights to put it there on your video on-demand service. Then once you've dealt with the person who gives you the rights, you are handed over to like another person in that company, and that person is responsible for giving you the materials. So you get the main movie, you get a trailer, you get like some images, for the box art that we just saw, some editorial metadata, maybe some subtitle files or other stuff. And then once you have that material in your possession, you need to transcode and format all of this material to such a specification that your interface, your platform, actually understands this. Then once you've done all of that stuff, you sort of like put it in a package. And once you have that package, you upload it to the platform and ta-da! There we have that page that we were looking at earlier. There's a handful of tasks. It's not so super hard. Anybody can do it. So let's have a look at what kind of tools we would use to sort of administer and keep track of where we are in the process. So securing the rights, well, you talk to the content salesperson or the lawyer or like to both. So you normally communicate by email, you use Word to do the contract, gather materials, email, file transfer, transcoding the video. It's maybe a bit more complex because it's a bit more technical. Preparing the package, a text editor or an XML editor, and then you use file transfer to upload it. All tools that you basically have on your laptop today. Why? Well, you're only doing this once, so you're not going to invest in something more fancy. You just need to get it done, and it's once, and it's not so hard. So this is for one movie. Now you know where I'm getting with this, right? So let's imagine we're doing this for a number of movies. It's still pretty doable. We still need to do like the same thing, except for we need to do it 5 times. We need to do it a bit more often. And then, at the end of the race, we have 5 movies from this one content provider, all like neatly on the platform where people can go and buy and rent it. Now, what tools would we use if we have 5 movies instead of 1? Well, obviously, we still use like the same tools because it's only 5, but now we have this concept of scheduling. Like when you have 5 movies, you need to decide, am I going to put them on all together at the same time? Am I going to put one first and then the other, and then in which order? So you have this concept of scheduling. Now for 5 movies, Excel, perfect tool. You can give these boxes like different colors and weeks and, perfectly doable. So we still use the tools that we have on the laptop. Now imagine it gets a little bit more complicated, that we're not only dealing with Lionsgate, but we're also dealing with Fox and Disney and Sony and Universal and DreamWorks and HBO and, it's a bit harder. Now, this is actually where, it becomes a little bit stressful because before you were only talking to one materials person that you had to deal with, and now all of a sudden you're talking to 5 lawyers, 5 materials people. It's already a bit harder. It's a bit more effort. It's more complex. It's easy to lose track of things. And what if we do this in different countries, in different languages? All of a sudden, like this problem just multiplies and multiplies by itself. But we're still only doing this on this one interface, like iTunes in this case. So on the interface side, we're still using all the same formats, the same way of ingesting, the same box art, same everything. It's hard, but it gets really, really hard if after all of this stuff, with different licensors in different countries, we have to start worrying about different platforms. Because each of these platforms has different encoding specs, different logistics, different reporting on the other side, it becomes actually quite super hard and stressful. So the hard things here, if you are in this business of making a video on demand service work across multiple screens, multiple countries, multiple networks, different formats. The hardest things are like to maximize the rights. The rights structures actually, if you multiply it against many titles, become quite complex. Somebody like BT or Virgin Media, they easily have between 80 and 120 different content providers, still operating here in one country. Liberty Global across Europe, does this across multiple countries, so it's already more complex. So you want to make sure that whoever buys the rights is coordinated with whoever does the scheduling, whoever does the operation, so everything is there in time. You don't lose rights that you've paid for and not making available to your customers. So very important to maximize the rights, because that is, if you're operating a video on demand service, where a lot of your money goes to. Then catch-up VOD. Very, very hard. You all know what catch-up VOD is? Or is there somebody who's unfamiliar with it? So if you have a linear television channel and your VOD service is somehow related to it, it's very stressful to ensure that what happens in your linear channel and what happens on your on-demand service is actually linked. Because normally the way that rights and rules work are by like an offset on what happens in your linear channel. So let's say that you have like an episode of Neighbors, and you want to make this episode of Neighbors available on your on-demand service 1 hour after it's finished playing on the main channel, or 1 hour before if it's like a premium catch-up service. What you actually need to do is to make sure that your linear channel and your on-demand service are completely aligned, because if your linear channel is 1 hour late and it's not aligned, all of a sudden these two things are like in the same time. If there's a football game or like an extra, I don't know, Prince William decides to have another baby and this needs to be announced to like the world, all of these things throw like linear schedules, upside down. So it's very important these two things get aligned, and people that do this job, that do it for Channel 4, Channel 5, ITV, BT, they actually spend quite a lot of time making sure that this is the case if they're doing it manually. Then materials logistics, I think this one, is pretty obvious. There is like a certain amount of time that the operations teams need to prepare that content, to reformat it, to encode it, to create that package that I was talking about earlier, in order for it to be there on time when the end consumers need to watch it. So there's quite a lot of stuff involved there. And then there's the internationalization, which is dealing with all the languages, but not just the languages, also the different versions of content, because regulatory issues or whatever. So these are like pretty hard things to take care of. Then transcoding, DRM, which is more technical thing related to each of the platforms. And then there is the issue of metadata transformation and publication. So just like each of these platforms, they have different specifications for the box art and the quality of the video itself. There's also the metadata issue that you need to deal with. Metadata is usually described in some form of XML. But the specification for like this file is different for each platform. Now, how do people deal with this? Normally, if they need to publish to 15 different platforms, they make it somebody else's problem. So if you're like a broadcaster, you go to somebody like Arkina, my company, or you go to Red Bee or to Encompass, and you say, guys, I need to get like this metadata on 15 different platforms. Please deal with it for me and do all of this other stuff, because we all do like encoding and transforming and materials logistics. So a lot of times, this is how you deal with the problem. You make it somebody else's problem. But if you have to deal with this yourself, it's actually quite challenging to make sure that you have, these 15 different platforms, connected televisions, Xboxes, PlayStations, Virgin Media, BT, whatever, YouView, whatever platforms you have here in the UK, to make sure that that metadata arrives to all of these different platforms on time and in the right format. And keeping track of all of that, in a sort of concerted way, because it all relates somehow to each other, is hard. So doing this manually, like using the tools that, I sort of proposed, if you had to do 1 or 5 or like 10 of those, is not efficient nor effective if you want to scale this, to a large number of platforms, a large number of formats, a large number of content owners. So how do you deal with this? Now, let me start telling you what is like the best way to deal with it, is to use like the Bibanjo software that that we have in Arkina, because that's exactly what it does. But if you look at how other people deal with it, a lot of people use the Bibanjo software. So BT uses it, Channel 5 uses it, AMC networks, Ubiquity, some other big US networks, Orange in France, Telefonica. But what you actually see is that there's different ways that lead to Rome. So there's the linear channel management systems like PLAT or like Syntec that are in place, a lot of pay television companies and broadcasters, they have some VOD functionality that also solves this problem. A lot of companies, historically, especially when they were a bit pioneering when it came to video on demand, decided to build their own solutions. Some of the most exotic solutions that I've come across was, at Channel 5. Before we started working with them, they had, and I never even knew these people existed, they had like an Excel developer. So that's somebody who writes like macros and software inside Microsoft Excel. And I've seen the most exotic Excel sheets in my life there, which, could fail like this wall probably like 20 times around, took like 10 minutes to open, and, crashed often. And then, we started to work with them. It became better. But people build their own solutions to dealing with these types of problems because they need to be dealt with. People start feeling the pain once this scales. And today, we're in a world that everybody needs to scale to more screens with more content and, better service. So a lot of people right now have this problem. Now, I didn't want to give a very salesy presentation, and I've already said a few words about Arkina when I started, but we're a media services company. We do a lot. We store content, we transport it, we do playout, so we're all over Europe. And we make it available on every screen. And that's the extent of my sales pitch today. Does anybody have any questions for me about video on demand in specific, video on demand workflow in specific, or video on demand business in general? If you don't have questions for me, I'm going to ask you questions. Okay, go ahead.
So where do you stop? Because it seems like you do almost everything.
For us, and the bit about Arkina that I can speak most authoritatively about is Bibanjo, because that's a company that I built together with my team, so I know it very well. For Bibanjo, we only deal with 2/3 of the workflow issue that you have in a video on demand team. You can basically divide any TV operation or video on demand operation into 3 separate areas. You have the editorial bits, which is where the people work who decide, what's going to be on the screen by which date. It's the people that buy the content. So the people that ultimately decide what the viewers are going to be able to watch. So that's the editorial bit. Then you have the operational bit, which basically takes over from the editorial people. So they take a schedule and they make sure that the content in that schedule appears on that screen with all the stuff around it in the right format at the right date. And those are the 2 bits that Bibanjo covers very, very well. So we solve that whole part of the workflow, and we really do help people to be more efficient and effective in that. But then there's a whole world that happens like after that. You have the whole commercial bits around it. So, you have to figure out what did people watch, how long did they watch it for, what were the conditions in my contract. So now I need to make a royalty calculation to figure out whether I pay minimum guarantees or overages, and then you have to administer all of these reports and payments. Part of it needs to feed back into the editorial team so they can learn from the historical performance to hopefully make better editorial decisions in the future and get a better business performance for for the service that they're running. We don't cover this. We have a partner for this in the US called MediaMorph, that's owned in part by Google, and we're quite well integrated with them. And we have a few US broadcasters, and we have Ubiquity where we're working together and providing a complete solution. But for Bibanjo, that's the part we don't cover. And then there's like a whole other world that I'm personally not so familiar with, but it's the whole world about monetizing like the ad opportunities around non-linear content. And there's like a bunch of businesses like Video Plaza and Freewheel that are very good at this, Auditude, and we're integrated with all of those, but we don't do it ourselves. And then as Arkina, what we do is, we do a lot, but we don't do everything. We do playout of channels, content processing, we do content storage and transport in the cloud, transformation in the cloud, we do the B-Banjo stuff, and then we have LVP and OTT solutions for people like Tier 1 and HBO and beIN Sports. And, yeah. So we do a lot, but not everything.
Hello.
Hi.
James from Clearly. Kind of with the world going to a sort of subscription model, all you can eat, recommendation engine driven, how important do you think editorialized cataloging and VOD is going to continue to be?
It's a very good question, because of course everybody that's in this business of creating personalized recommendations will argue that, you know, like the machine is going to do all of that thinking for the consumer. And I think to some extent, you know, it is true. I think it's going to be very important in terms of optimizing the business performance of these services. Especially in video on demand, I see it as something that's really feasible, because you're dealing with content that, you know, in a lot of cases has been available elsewhere, and there's like data available on this content, so you can know how well it performed, like in the US box office or like in your local box office. You can see how it did maybe on like a premium linear channel like Sky something, Sky Atlantic or Sky One, or I don't know what it's called, or Canal Plus, before it finally ends up there. And I'm convinced that, you know, smart people can develop algorithms that actually enable personalization that will help people to, you know, click with, you know, more gusto, because it's exactly what they want to see. So I think eventually it will be quite important. I think, you know, today it's still a bit like a promise, it's a bit science fiction. I think, you know, like the whole bit about video on demand, I think in general it's still more a promise than like a business reality. If you talk to any Hollywood studio and you ask them how much of their money directly actually comes from digital versus the more traditional ways of distributing content, 90-something% still comes from like normal linear channel type of business licensing. Until not too long ago, the biggest customer of any Hollywood studio was still Walmart. I think that's changed a few years ago, but this is in very, very recent history. So I've been working in video on demand since I think like about 99, 2000. And back then we were like convinced that within 5 years, you know, all people would have stopped watching normal television channels. And the promise of, you know, like seeing what you want, where you want, when you want it, how you want it, you know, is like irresistible. But the reality is the business, the money still follows all of these old traditional ways of doing that. And I think that for like the industry, especially the industry that spends all this money creating this content, because it's expensive business making good content, it's a big challenge, because their eyeballs are not anymore where the money is. And you know, everybody knows what kind of happened to the music industry as a result of the same thing. So long answer, the short one is yes, I think recommendation is super important, and eventually they will find a way to get more minutes from each individual by serving that individual what he actually likes to see, but I think it's a while off. No.
So for now, the editors are safe in their jobs?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. As long as we can keep selling the promise, you know, we'll probably have our jobs, yeah. More questions? Who runs here a video on demand service in the room directly? That's a lot of people. Which one are you already?
Two in Norway. It's commercial broadcast.
And how do you deal with these workflow issues? Do you keep it in Excel, or do you have your own systems, or did you have somebody develop something for you?
We have Vimeo, which has developed
And for you? Over there?
So, I'm from Maxdome, Germany,
Mm-hmm.
and we have our own asset management system to do this kind of stuff.
Excellent. And you?
We're running A1 TV in Austria,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, we have a CMS, and basically for every point which you mentioned, we have an actual department to take care of all of the encoding stuff, content.
So my curiosity here is actually, were there 3 or 4 of you like running your own? I might have forgotten somebody. Three different companies here. So at what point did you decide to develop your own system? So when did you start feeling like the pain that you said we can't do this like in an Excel sheet anymore? Starting with you.
I guess it just grew on us. We started with, it's just the different, I guess the rights was the first thing that came, to keep track of. So I guess we just built it up as the service group. Of course, much of it comes from the linear broadcast. It started there, so we knew we had to take care of rights and so on.
Because you started with Catch-Up, right?
Yeah.
As a first service. And for you in Maxdome?
So, when we decided to develop an asset management
Because Maxdome started, I think, in about 2005, right? It was one of the first.
Yeah, it was about 2006.
Yeah, it was one of the first ones.
And at the beginning, it was also much about Excel files and manual CMS publishing. But at one, I don't know what was the number, but at one point, all the Excel manuals is too big if you have a specific number of content, and then yeah, you need to have a bigger solution.
It's a long time, 2005, 2006. And for you?
Yeah, but I think basically from the beginning, because we started with quite a big catalog, and we knew that there's a lot of things to do, and dealing with 15 different studios and other contracts.
Yeah,
and
of
stuff
course.
like that. So it was planned from the beginning, and then it grew on us because we were not able to imagine what stuff will come to us, and then it grew all the time.
And when did you start with your service? In which year?
Yeah. Good question. I think about 6 or 7 years ago.
Also. Yeah. Interesting. More questions from anybody?
I'll be sneaky and ask another. What do you think's next for VOD? We all see Netflix coming along with a subscription model cannibalizing our market. Do you think we're all going to be subsumed by Netflix, or do you think there's another direction the market will go in?
I really like, from a consumer's perspective, I like the Netflix model where you pay like a small amount of money that's maybe a third or a quarter of what you pay to your MSO today, and for a lot less money you get like a better service, because that's what Netflix kind of is. It's like the Spotify of television. I'm a very enthusiastic Spotify user. I've never bought a CD anymore, not once, since I started subscribing to Spotify a year ago. And I think if Netflix and people like Netflix like do that kind of job, they will accomplish the same. But it's more an idea than a reality, because Netflix doesn't have all the content. Like you want to watch like the HBO stuff, I don't think you can get that on Netflix. So I think in television it's a lot more divided. And like if you like the HBO stuff and you like the Netflix stuff and you like Amazon right now is also starting to produce its own content that will be exclusive to like the Amazon service, and if you like all of it, you still need to go to an aggregator, so to like an iTunes store or to a Sony store or like a Microsoft store or like to your MSO to get a hold of all of that stuff. So I think, you know, things like Netflix are good if you decide like your time is precious and like you're going to spend your precious time just on like the Netflix content. But it's unlikely ever to be a complete solution for everybody. You know, there's still Formula One, there's sports, there's other content, but it's a very good service. You know, like let's call it what it is. It's a very good service at a very competitive price. But I also read in the newspaper, I think it was this morning, that they're rolling out so aggressively that they've run out of money. And like, what do companies, you know, like Netflix, that generate a lot of positive noise? When they run out of money, they raise more money, and they will continue to sell the promise. And then we'll have to see whether the business reality actually lives up to it. And sometimes I'm like amazed with these things. You know, like the other day when somebody paid 15 billion for WhatsApp, Facebook, and that's because like for Facebook the promise of WhatsApp has a numerical value of 15 billion US dollars. Now Netflix, I'm sure they're going to raise more money to continue their aggressive expansion. They have a super good you know, operating methodology. You know, they're a really well-run company operationally. I've read some stories about like their philosophy about like things like encoding, and they really think hard about like how to solve these problems and do it better than anybody else. So I'm sure they're an attractive company for some people to invest in. But at the end of the day, the only thing that makes these businesses work is actually finding people that want to watch the content there's on it, and finding them in sufficient ways, in sufficient numbers, you know, so that it adds up to more income than outcome. And I think, you know, that in some sense, the stuff that I'm talking about here, like all of the operational stuff and a lot of the stuff that a lot of us, you know, in this room probably work in, because I don't think there's many people. Is anybody here from the production side, like making content themselves? So all of us in this room, what we're basically doing is we're finding more efficient ways to get the content that people want to see that's created by somebody else to those people. You know, in that sense, we're all in the same boat. But I think you know, like the magical bit still happens with the creators of this content, and you know, making sure it is appealing for those audiences.
Quick one, can you just clarify how you work with people like Syntec and Pilabs? Is it the case, and these are the ones where you're creating schedules for linear playout?
Yeah.
And you said in Bibanjo you have an editorial function where you're dealing with rights windows and
Yeah.
which platforms contain which content. Do you find your customers are actually having to enter the same data into two different places, or at least the rights for linear in one system, the rights for VOD in another?
Okay. So Bibanjo doesn't do linear. So we made the decision when we started that, you know, we were going to focus all of our energies only thinking about teams managing video on demand services. And to my best knowledge, Bibanjo is the only company in the world that does this today, that it's 100% focused on making the lives of people needing to do this across many different platforms easier. Syntec and Pilat and Mediagenics, you know, they're basically similar companies in the sense that they have the same philosophy, except for they started working on people running linear channels, and then they decided to, you know, spend a bit of time on like non-linear. But like the argument that I always use is, you know, these guys, they make 95% of their money on linear, and probably the non-linear bits they give it away for free. If somebody buys like a linear system and we're only focused on non-linear, therefore we surely must be, you know, better for that part than, you know, all of these linear channel management companies. And the reality is that, you know, we've integrated with several customers the linear system with Bibanjo's system. And the thinking behind it is they want to have the best of both worlds. So they're running their linear channel operation using Syntec or Pilat, or Mediagenics, or Harris, or something like that. And then for nonlinear, they use our stuff, and it's nicely integrated, like in the background, so they don't have to enter things twice, and there's no possibility for stuff being incorrect or having two different versions of data. Any last question? Otherwise, I'm going to invite you all for a coffee outside here. Okay, thank you very much.